Hi, Misha here, and let's look at another model from Motor City Classics Legendary Warships. These are 1,250 scale diecast ship models, relatively inexpensive, 25-30 bucks, and kind of along the same lines as Atlas Edition, De Agostini, IXO, Eagle Moss, so on and so forth. Nice little pieces just to have, and you can buy a bunch without really breaking the bank. And the first time we looked at the USS Hornet of the Yorktown class over here. And now we're going to check out the USS Lexington of the Lexington class. This is CV-2, really the U.S. Navy's first operational fleet carrier. And in the past, in a couple of videos, we've also looked at the USS Saratoga here. This is CV-3, her sister ship. This is also 1,250 scale from Atlas Editions, so different make, same scale. And these are the two members of the class. And as far as the model quality, it's pretty commensurate with both, frankly. So with that, yeah, let's just talk about our history and how this came to be. One thing that's quite interesting and nice, the Lexington here is more in a World War II configuration, whereas the Saratoga back here is more in a 1930s configuration. We'll talk about that in a minute. As is famously known, these did not start off as aircraft carriers. When they were laid down, in fact, a total of 6 in the class were laid down 1919, 1920. They were to be battle cruisers, the hot new thing that kind of came about at the end of World War I. As it turned out, the HMS Hood kind of demonstrated the shortcomings of the whole battle cruiser thing, so whatever way, the Washington Naval Treaty strikes again, meaning that all 6 ships had to be scrapped, except there was a proviso in the treaty that allowed 2 vessels to be converted to be aircraft carriers for experimental purposes. Now, the U.S.'s first official aircraft carrier, CV-1, was the USS Langley, which herself was a conversion. She truly was an experimental trials carrier, though, much like the Hosho in Japan, and even the Hermes in the UK to a lesser extent. They only operated 2 to 3 dozen planes and had very noticeable limitations. So out of the 6 ships laid down, they picked the hulls of Lexington and Saratoga because they were the furthest along, between 20 and 21% done. And so they would rework them into fleet carriers, first launching in 1925, and we'll get into a little more details in a minute. But the compromises made were apparent, but they were still very effective for what they were. In fact, these were the largest and in some ways the most capable carriers America would have until the Midway class. Of course, in many other ways, the Essex class would succeed them later on. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty limited carriers to 27,000 tons. However, for conversions, an exception was made up to 33,000 tons. How much did these weigh? Between 35 and 36,000 tons. How did the U.S. get away with being heavier? Well, let's be honest, no one's picking up battleships to weigh them. They basically just did because who could tell? This is kind of the same reason the Bismarck and the Tirpitz were heavier. Yeah, everyone was kind of fudging things already. And, yeah. They are quite massive. They are 888 feet long. Of that, about 866 feet are usable flight deck. It's made of teak wood, not an armored deck, and it has a beam of about 110 feet, with about 105 feet of that being usable flight deck. It has a very large internal hangar with room not only for the planes, but also repair facilities, machine shops, spares, what have you. It had 2 deck elevators, center line. The front was meant for heavier objects, the rear a little bit lighter, so one kind of for bombers, one for fighters, nominally speaking. These were originally designed to achieve about 34 knots as battle cruisers. The conversion to carriers dropped that down to 33 knots, so still very fast. And they had a decent range of about 10,000 miles, although that would be exceeded by the Yorktown class at about 12,500 in later carriers, so, whatever you do. And they were originally fitted with 5-inch guns for air defense and 50 caliber machine guns. But interestingly, they also were fitted with 8-inch guns for self-defense. They were basically 8 and 8. And that's why I say this one's in actually an earlier configuration here, because it still has those. Quite interesting. So let's put Saratoga here on the spinny thing first, because it is, like I said, in the early configuration. These ships were laid down, like I said, 1920, and first launched now as fleet carriers in 1925, and were commissioned in 1927, and were ready for operations by 1928-29. And early on, they were used, as early carriers often were, to kind of figure out what the hell they were doing. No one knew. This was newfangled technology all around. Some things were put on, taken off, like the original catapult. It just wasn't useful. They were also used to support various humanitarian operations. They provided power for Tacoma, Washington during a disaster. They would go to South America, kind of show the flag. But yeah, they were mostly used for fleet exercises in the 1930s, including various feints on Pearl Harbor, war gaming, and proved early on how lethal a large carrier could be. And in 1936, there was kind of the first major update. For example, the flight deck was lengthened and it was widened a bit, and the guns started to be changed out. Now, like I said, this has the 8-inch guns. Those were meant for surface defense. At that time, when these were being built, the powers that be were just not convinced that aircraft or support vehicles could adequately protect a carrier. This was a large investment. After all, it had nearly 2,800 personnel on board, and a lot of time, money, and resources went in here. So they gave it some guns to try to defend itself, but they pretty much proved useless. That's just not how warfare was going. In theory, they could fire both directions, but in reality, only one, because if they tried to fire across the deck, probably problems would occur. And the 5-inch kind of dual purpose guns for air defense and whatnot proved less than satisfactory, as did the 50 cals, at least against newer aircraft. So this would be kind of systematically updated before and during World War II, using things like Boffers and more radar-directed stuff. And that's another thing too. This one here doesn't have the newer radar setup on the tower, and a few other things. Kind of interesting. It also has earlier style planes on the deck. These were originally designed and were fielded in the 30s with a fighter group of about 18 plus spares, and a bomber group of a total of 36, one of one type and one of another, So a fighter group of up to 36, and a bomber group of 38, even sometimes 40, dive and torpedo. Plus, they would carry scout observation planes, utility planes. In total, they were operating with around 79 active planes and another 30 in reserve spare. A practice that American carriers started to go with was hanging spare planes and parts from the top of the hangar deck. This allowed a lot more to be fitted in. Ultimately, they would be able to fit as many as 90 active aircraft plus reserves on these. And the reserve numbers, yeah, they could get pretty high too. So over 100 aircraft. Like I said, it was a very large boat for what it was, and quite fast. But they would successfully war game before, and both would serve with great renown at the beginning of World War II. So now let's focus on the lucky lady, the gray lady, the Lexington herself. On to the spinny thingy. As is famously known, one of the shortcomings of the attack on Pearl Harbor was that the American fleet carriers were not there and thus not caught unawares. Lexington here was en route to Midway when the attack happened, actually to deliver new aircraft to help reinforce the garrison there. But once the attack at Pearl Harbor happened, she was ordered to turn around and head back. And her first couple of missions didn't go as planned. First, she was supposed to make a kind of feinting assault on the Marshall Islands so that Saratoga could attack the real target, but this was called off before it happened because Wake Island fell. Then she was assigned to go harry the Japanese at Wake Island, but her refueler was sunk because it wasn't escorted, so she did not have enough go-go juice to get there and do what she needed to do. So she had to go back, do that. Really, her first action would come in February when, near Rabaul, she would be jumped by Japanese planes, and her planes would do a very admirable job of defending. Although it helped that the Japanese there did not have adequate armament, namely torpedoes, to really damage a heavy ship like this. Because, she did have good armor for that day and time, at least compared. Moving into March, she would go to the Coral Sea and kind of harass Japanese shipping along with Yorktown and other naval assets. Just kind of running around, using her fighters and bombers to do what they could do to support and deny. And then at the end of the month, she would go into Pearl Harbor for a bit of an overhaul and refit. This is where they would remove the 8-inch guns, but her 5-inch guns, 12 of them, would remain. She would get some updated air defense, though, as well as getting a new radar system. And by the end of April, she was ready to go again, and alongside Yorktown, Lexington would be sent into what would be known later as the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the battle started off quite good for the two U.S. carriers. They both took part in damaging the light carrier Shoho, as well as attacking other Japanese assets and holding their own. But this came at a cost. Lexington here would take 2 hits each from bombs and torpedoes. And at first, the damage did not seem that bad. Unfortunately, as time went on, it worsened. Turns out the fuel lines had ruptured. She'd also received a lot of just little damage, but cuts, death by 1,000 cuts, as you were. All the near misses and just activity of the battle, it all added up, and a major fuel leak was noted. And after some attempts to ventilate the ship failed, there started to be some secondary explosions from the fuel, yada yada. Things were getting bad, and friendly ships had to come alongside and take her crew off. So on May 8, she was ordered scuttled and was sent to the bottom via American torpedoes. Lexington's loss in May of 42 would leave her sister ship Saratoga one of the few fleet carriers around. Although at the time of the Battle of the Coral Sea, she was actually in for repairs. She had already been hit by a Japanese torpedo, and so she wasn't really available for service until later that summer and would be used in the Guadalcanal campaign, the whole Solomon's thing later on. She would actually help sink a couple of light carriers and destroyers and would be torpedoed again in September, leaving Hornet the only ship for a while, and then she would rejoin the fight later on, going on and on. And she would be further refit throughout the war, having her 5-inch guns removed, better radar installed. During 1942, the flight group was pretty much at its maximum. For example, they had 21 fighters on board each one, namely F-4F Wildcats at this time. They also had 37 of the new Dauntless, as well as a dozen of the older Devastator bombers. They also had various scouts and recon aircraft, what have you, utility support craft. So pretty good flight group, although Saratoga later in the war would see her flight group reduced to 70 or less because of newer aircraft being so much larger, like the F-6F and the newer bombers like the Avenger. So, kind of just how that went. She would be used to support various operations throughout 1943. Interestingly, she would actually help support the Royal Navy in 1944 and then be used as a training carrier later in that year before returning to service to help with the attack on Okinawa in 1945. Interestingly, by this point, Saratoga was kind of a dedicated night carrier, or at least nearly so dedicated, kind of working out night operations. I'm sure that wasn't hairy at all. Unfortunately, her reputation for being hit again continued in May when a kamikaze hit her, and so she had to go back in for repairs. And at this time, she was permanently converted over into being a school carrier, essentially. A lot of her space was turned over to classrooms and bunk rooms and various things for training. However, she had one more important mission to carry out after the war. She helped ferry 30,000 Allied soldiers home. And after this nice end to her career, she was declared surplus to needs in 1946 and actually would be used for nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll. So that was her end. Both quite interesting carriers in their own right and very much part of U.S. naval history. Well, I hope you enjoyed this overview. Of course, I skimmed over a lot of things, and I apologize for my voice. It's still not quite back to full norm, but I really wanted to do something, and haven't done many naval videos in a long, long time. These are nice models for what they are. Would I like to have a larger 700 scale? Sure, but those tend to run 80, even $100 these days, if you can find them, and I don't think anyone's even done this in that scale on Diecast. And to be fair, this scale still lets them be 8-9 inches long, enough to have detailed planes on the flight deck. So, good representative pieces. And very important carriers. Yeah, Langley was the first, but it wasn't really that operational. In fact, it was converted out of being a carrier in the 1930s anyway, at least officially. Ranger, CV-4, well, that was kind of an exercise in seeing what a light carrier could do, and it kind of showed the limitations, frankly. That's why CV-5 and CV-6 went back to being fleet carriers. But I hope maybe someone will do both Wasp and Ranger one day. because they have their own stories to tell as well. Well, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.